Frankly, I'm not entirely sure what is up with all the tentacle-themed Metroidvanias lately, or even entirely sure how to feel about it. But Doomblade does continue the trend, albeit with more unique control schemes that allow it to break a decent number of the standard Metroidvania traditions. And of course, who could turn down a game with music like this? That said, we start out in a fairly standard way, being weak, taking on the role of the last Gloomling who lacks any powers or even anything special about them. Heck, we can't even attack at first. But what we do get is a little voice in our head, beckoning us forward to solve at least a little bit of that by leading us to the object that is the title of the game, the Doomblade, which gives us the ability to attack. Now that we've paired up Doom and Gloom, we start off by breaking the first rule of swords in Metroidvanias, where if you get a sword, it would just swing in front of you, and you'd expect double jumps, special attacks, etc. in the future. Instead, our attack is actually not only our primary form of dealing with enemies, but also our primary form of movement and traversal. And as we go through the game, it's that effect that gets a buff, not our base movement. Though with the sword, the story proceeds forward, both with dialogue and prompting by the sentient blade itself, but also through various lore stones, computer terminals, and even sometimes indecipherable gloomstones that, yes, you will want to remember the location of. You learn the story of how the world fell into the situation it is now. You'll learn a bit about the World Eater just beyond the veil. You'll learn about how the different factions of this world came to be in their unique situation and opinions. And if you go a bit off the beaten path, you'll even find various side quests that can alter the ending of the game, from a spore you can spread throughout the world, lost souls to forge your blade, and a handful of other fun, almost Easter egg level secrets and bits of information. Or you can just skip through those and just go for the main objective. Now, I did not 100% this game, so I don't know about all the potential ending changes, mainly because I only got to play through the game twice before this review, and there is not a map marking system, which would have been very handy for keeping track of the Gloomstone specifically. Various objects that you can only get with special abilities would have been nice to add that as well, and that can all influence the endgame. Now, gameplay-wise, which in my opinion is one of the most important aspects of a Metroidvania, it's mostly good, with an actually fun fast travel system later on as well that doesn't just teleport you, but sends you flinging through space. You even fight there once. But it's still a mixed bag situation. This is because while for most of the game, the movement tech and combat is absolutely fun, engaging, and interesting, it does run into a few friction points. The first big one being just starting out, it will feel awkward starting out the game for most people, because you're used to those standard Metroidvania controls. This game actually uses much more like a twin-stick shooter, and requires a similar unique hold of your controller if you want to go that route. Though personally I just ended up going mouse and keyboard since it feels much more natural to me with this type of game, and I found it easier to aim and attack with that setup, especially at more distant enemies. The other friction points are mostly just tied to specific enemies and encounters. And don't get me wrong, the actual bosses and world movement are smooth as butter whenever you get used to them. It's just that specific encounters were weirdly tuned, with some of them requiring very precise ricochet techniques with a skill to progress to the next stage that felt clunky no matter how many times I did it, but were doable with either a spam approach or a lot of patience, since you have to bank it around the target to actually hit that in its weak spot with your little electrical thing. While the other encounters basically had me wanting to ask the developers to pay me to replace the switches in my mouse, these being the swarm encounters. There's not a ton of them, but they are treated similarly to boss fights, where you're locked in a room, but I swear they were more click intense for my mouse than even the original Diablo, and every one of them feels like it goes just one wave too long for me. I think what makes them stand out most in my memory though was that these swarm encounters often used barrier enemies with the exception of a few, but these are basically enemies with either damage or bouncing barriers on one side of them that kept you from directly engaging with the target. More than once this resulted in me being bounce or stun locked like crazy and dying to that rather than actual positioning other than just the RNG movement of the enemies. Now, like I said, none of these are super common, they're very limited in how often they show up, and they did give you a lot of practice for dealing with the bosses, but they were mandatory to beat for progress, and were usually things that made me take a break from the title after beating them, rather than giving me the urge to do just one more thing like most of the other encounters and bosses in the game. Also, a weird thing that seemed to make itself prominent during these encounters specifically, and I didn't really encounter it outside of them was the inconsistency of taking damage was highlighted a bit with it. I think it has something to do with the projectile hitboxes, but it felt like sometimes I would dash through bullets, but other times I couldn't. I think you're not supposed to be able to, but I was just getting a slightly off angle and was able to actually hit them with that. It could also just be a stage of animation thing, but you would feel it a lot with the bouncy wizards in some of these encounters, since they would move their shield out of the way to shoot, and if you launch at them from far away, about half the time I'd go through their bullet, the other half the time I'd get knocked out of a dash by it. That rant out of the way, especially since it's a lot of words for very few moments in the game. The actual movement in the game is super enjoyable. You start with a basic dash towards enemies, you eventually get a horizontal dash skill that works without enemies as well, but it gets really interesting as you get more puzzle and discovery focused abilities, which range from ways to trigger doors to abilities to move through rocks, and even a couple ways to spawn inert enemies that let you use abilities to move to harder to reach locations. There's also vertical movement text with a downward and upward smash, which you can use offensively as well, though they do come on a cooldown that you modify with items. The nice thing about all this, yes, even with the ability to spawn inert targets, they're used to fight the bosses to great effect, and I found most of the bosses and travel puzzles to work amazingly with this in most cases, with only 2 of the bosses even being a little bit fiddly, and they're both later game encounters that aren't bad, they just set the bar quite high with the rest of the bosses. In terms of flow outside of bosses, while it does not conspicuously push you in any given direction, I found that with the exception of one situation, the direction you need to go was extremely natural, since you will often unlock a movement tech that you had recently seen a need for, and it trains you on it a lot by having that movement be necessary to get out of the zone you just finished and got the ability from. The one exception to this kind of guided approach that is not conspicuous is fairly late game, where you get a series of key items, each to unlock the next in a single large area. The location of the third item that you need to use to unlock the ability of the area was in a weird place that I thought was just map fog over some thorns, but reality is there was a door down there. Now, I won't show where it is because it's absolutely a spoiler, but if you play the game, just know it's to do with the dividing enemies. Now, item-wise, it's not very special. Most of the items will remind you of Hollow Knight unlocks, with parts that upgrade your sword, improve your cooldowns, and a handful of items to unlock doors, side goals, and even items you can sacrifice for currency and bonus rewards, though you'll not be getting things like charms or anything more complex to mess with, and most of the non-destructible items are definitely more for unlocking abilities or keys. Now, as a bit of a note as we approach the end of this, do not look at the achievements if you do not want to be spoiled on certain story beats. They're not specific or detailed, but they do foreshadow important moments that are much better taken with the flow of the game rather than before playing it, and you'll get the vast majority of them by playing through the game, and all but a couple of them if you go out of your way to do all the side quests, since there are a couple speedrun achievements. Now, if you're interested in more tentacle-themed Metroidvanias, I'll toss one up on screen now, this time a detective and Lovecraftian-inspired one. And if you found this review helpful, or if you absolutely hated it, play with some of those buttons underneath the video before you head out. And if you have any questions about the game, ask them down below and I'll be happy to answer them.